Hello, this is Informer, a show that reveals the latest ideas from artists, thinkers, and technologists. Informer invites you behind the screen to meet the people sketching, hacking, and imagining the next versions of our world. I'm Roddy Schrock, your host, and in each episode, I spotlight creative minds grappling with a changing world through art, technology, or often both. And I hope you'll subscribe to this podcast at informerpodcast.com, where you can also find show notes, links, and more information on all of the artists and projects that we discuss. I met Bassem Saad a couple of years ago when he was living in New York. I found the young artist's video work to be compelling and strange in the right ways. It's theoretically on target and is full of formal considerations that lend it heft, while also fizzing with queer energy and insights. His background is in design and architecture, and he talks about how viewing a Shanna Moulton piece at the Palais de Tokyo was the thing that triggered his hunger for making video. I find his work deeply incisive, especially in this strange moment, and it was a pleasure to speak to him on the line from Berlin. I began by asking him about how he grew up, where, and how he made the transition from architecture to art.
So I was born and raised, and I studied in Beirut, Lebanon, and I did my undergraduate education in architecture, and that was between Beirut and Paris. And then while studying architecture, I sort of decided after doing several internships that I didn't wish to pursue a career in a traditional design practice, and that was also at the same time when I had, like, after spending the semester in Paris, I think that's when I really understood how art functions in like our contemporary moment, and particularly how contemporary art functions. I think that was sort of new to me. I wouldn't say that I grew up attending a lot of exhibitions, or I can't say I grew up with like a great proximity to cultural production or contemporary cultural production. So I feel like it took me a few years to really wrap my head around that. And during this time, I also started doing a bit of writing.
It's interesting that you come from this architecture and design world. Was there literally a moment where you decided or realized that it was important to call yourself an artist, or to identify even to yourself as an artist?
Well, I would say my first kind of entry point in terms of my entry point into history of art and my entry point into artistic work that is political or openly ideological was, I think, when I familiarized myself with the Situationist International. I think that was kind of my entry point from architecture into artistic practice. Like going to a lot of art exhibitions, specifically in Paris, and then coming back to Beirut and understanding the milieu in Beirut and who are the artistic practitioners, who are the contemporary artists, who are the writers in Beirut who are adjacent to art. I think that's when I realized, okay, like I will need to do this kind of residency situation because I didn't get a training in art. So I thought, okay, I will need to start presenting myself. And then I started working on some independent projects. And at that point, I think for a long time, I thought, like maybe for several months or up to a year, I thought it's kind of strange to start calling yourself an artist before you have like an established trajectory, or before you've made several works. But I think I was just like, okay, I can say I'm an artist, and then I'll be judged on whether I'm a good artist or not, or whether like I was like, okay, functionally, this imposter syndrome won't help. So I just decided to start, like, once I made like I think one or two projects, I started presenting myself as an artist and writer. Yeah, I think it took like to remove several layers of conditioning and socialization, and then to just decide, okay, like it's not necessarily like to say one is an artist is not really to like claim being able to fill up any big shoes. It's like one occupation among many. You've decided that you're like an artist. That's what you're going to do, in your life, and that's fine. Like you don't need to. It doesn't need to be. You don't need to hype it up too much or place that label on a pedestal or anything.
Could you talk a little more about art as an occupation and sort of like how you see that functioning in the world if one were to think of it as a job, for lack of a better word?
I think a lot of artists have secondary occupations that they don't incorporate into their branding or something, and that's totally fine as long as you can find a balance.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the artists in particular that have inspired you?
One of the earliest examples of, let's say, video art that I saw in a gallery or in an exhibition that I thought, wow, this is really fun. And I love that someone can make a career out of this. Is I remember I saw the work of Shayna Moulton, who's kind of like a hilarious video artist at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. Like that was, I think, my first interface with contemporary video art production. I mean, I had watched like from History of Art, like I had watched a lot of films and videos here and there, but I think like that was like I think that was one of my earliest encounters that were, I would say, formative or that have stuck.
I love Shanna Moulton. And was it like Whispering Pines or something like that that you saw?
It was the one with on digestion and self-care. And it was the video that had Shakira's Waka Waka.
I didn't see that coming, but that's super cool.
Yeah. And I think in terms of that was, I would say that was around my fourth year in architecture. And then going back to Beirut, and doing my final year thesis, I would say that like so many probably other um, research-based video artists or writers and people who work in video, I was for sure sort of taken by Hitler's practice. I think that is formative to myself and to many other people practicing in the particular niche that I operate in. From the history of art, I think I look back on the work for sure of the work of Chris Marker, later on, like a lot of the work of Hanun Farouki. These are, I feel like, just the bread and butter of like any person who is kind of like theoretically inclined and doing this kind of research practice that's politically engaged and somehow touches on media studies. Like I feel like these are the pillars of that sort of work.
Your emphasis on writing and the kind of theoretical aspect is critical to everything that you're doing. And I've noticed in even the way that you craft your bio, you point out the fact that you were born on September 11th, which evokes all sorts of meanings.
When 9/11 happened, I was kind of like a child in Beirut. But I think it came to shape. I don't even need to. I feel like I don't even need to qualify this. Like it came to shape the world to such a great extent, and for sure, it shaped the region. It shaped the Arab world. It shaped like outside of the U.S. Its effects were so far-reaching, so tectonic. Like they really changed the formation of the world. Like changed how people move around, changed the geopolitics of our region to such a great extent that I feel like, and I've never, I think, directly dealt with legacies or histories of 9/11 in my work, but it's always been indirectly like looming in the background, whether it's in the work that my creative partner and I, Edwin Nasser, the work we've done around visualization and the production of virtual media by the US Army and by Hezbollah and by the Iranian regime. Like that project for sure is, I feel like, I would say, is located in the longue durée of 9/11. Even I think even the most recent film I made, like touches on uprisings in Beirut and New York, and somehow, like I don't think there are direct linkages anywhere here, but it's like more, it's within this kind of mythology of post 9/11, like still like how our current moment and our current uprisings, even in the Arab world, even in kind of like the late Arab Spring, like how they're always sort of interpreted against US foreign policy. Like that is always present, and that is always present in any sort of regional politics. Often in my work, there is an attention to the geopolitics that are latent in any situation. And so, yeah, in that way, I would say
Right. Yeah.
9/11 is always there.
One of the things that I've admired about your work so much is that you do connect this very personal, lived kind of interiority with really big global issues. Could you maybe speak a little bit about where some of that comes from, and also your focus on issues around sexuality and its connection to larger issues?
Yeah, I think my relationship to queer politics is very fraught or something. Like I've never really, I think, made work about queerness as an identity. Not to distance myself from that in any way, but I think like I've always factored in sexuality or sexual identification through the work, but always in a way that's diagonal. And I think at least when I've been responding to conditions or responding to theoretical questions or to what is called the problem space of a work, like the what any work is attempting to tackle, I've always felt like it makes more sense to insert like a queer protagonist or like a queer facet or a queer mode of relationality into a work that is not per se about queer identity. I've always felt like that's a more, at least in my work, a more interesting way of going about it. Whether it's in like the film, my second film, like Kink Retrograde, which is really about like toxicity and the waste crisis, particularly in Lebanon, but also like modes of governance that produce systemic toxicity and demand resilience, like resilience as a rhetoric and as a discourse that is imposed on weakened communities or weakened subjects. I decided to like insert kind of like thoughts on kink or queerness through that, and not talk, not, you know, it's not the main thing, but then it comes out in some extent. And even in the last film, like Congress of Idling Persons, like there are some references to fetishes or to like cultures around sexuality that I'm like attributing bigger meanings to or something.
And picking up on that, Congress of Idling Persons, that's a work that is still in development.
It's almost, I would say it's finished.
Okay.
I'm trying to like send it off to festivals and interested individuals and people who could present it to the public.
I don't know. It's been a while since I've seen a new work that feels so of a moment. And that one, I feel, just captures something that is one of the first things I've seen that feels as though it's very much of this like strange transitional time. And
Congress of Idling Persons is a film that I feel like I was like forced to make because there was no way I could have done any other film after. And I feel like you were there all along, like starting 2019 and into the end of 2020. Basically, like the end of 2019 was the uprising in Lebanon, in Beirut, that basically like me and everyone I know in the city, like we suspended our entire lives for 3 months. So I moved to New York at the beginning of 2020 before COVID happened. And then COVID happened, was the lockdown moment. And then after that, there was this other historical rupture with the George Floyd protests in New York. And I was just off the back of the uprising in Beirut. And so that felt like a revival and a rekindling of whatever was going on back there. And it also felt like an exit out of, or at least some kind of oscillating movement away from the pandemic lockdown. And then the summer happened and like the protests continued. And then I had to go back to Beirut because my visa expired, or like my allotted time had run out. And then I went back to Beirut a few days before the explosion, before the Beirut port explosion, which is like where in 4 days we will be in 5 days we will be commemorating the 1 year anniversary back in Beirut. And that just like those, I think those three events, like there was no way I could have done a work that was, how can I say this, like more focused on like my own research interests or more focused on like a longer term research that I was working on. It felt like I'm being shuttled around through my work, and then all of these events seem to continue to happen. So I felt like I needed to make a work that also honors these events or attempts to take some kind of record of how they were perceived or talked about or addressed through word of mouth, through like discourse that was being produced at this time, through the images that were being produced in the uprisings in both places.
And I think based on what I've seen so far of that, some of the really beautiful work that you've done just around the production as well as the kind of audio production as well speaks to these different kind of levels of engagement and sort of self-reflection and this kind of mirroring. And
The film, like there's a very prominent song in the film that is titled "Dreams of the Imagination," and it's by one of the performers inside the film, Sandy Shamoud. So she's a musical artist. She's a dear friend of mine, and her track is in the film, and it's the song in itself is in dedication to the first night of the uprising in
Mhm.
Beirut.
Going back to your writing and thinking about the kind of just timeliness of so much of the way that you work and the way that that's reflected in the outputs of your work. In an essay that I believe you re-edited in the spring of 2021, you wrote, "Before the virus, there was tear gas. Before tear gas, there was flaming trash," which I thought was just a beautifully poetic encapsulation of so many things that I think you're describing in the film and now.
Yeah. So that particular genealogy that is in that line, like the flaming trash, tear gas, and the virus, is like it's kind of a diaristic or autobiographic kind of lineage, but it starts from 2000. I mean, I'm reflecting on my time in Beirut mainly, but also in New York, I would say. Basically, like in 2015 there were the waste revolts, what was called the waste revolts in Lebanon, which was this like major waste crisis that then led to a lot of street activity and mobilization and like burning of trash as protest. So that was in 2000, that was a moment in 2015, and a lot of people historicize the 2019 uprising by linking it to its like predecessor, the more like um, the smaller and like more incomplete revolt in 2015. So that's kind of the flaming trash. And then in the 4 years between 2015 and 2019, Lebanon was kind of um, the symptoms of its collapse were becoming more and more apparent. And like from 2015 to 2019, there was no real structural solution to the waste crisis. And so that text you're referencing in particular was like published next to like a screening of my second film, King Retrograde. So it was kind of like which and the second film I've made is more of a reflection on or like is tied historically to the 2015 uprisings and like infrastructural degradation in Lebanon and in general. So that is the flaming trash, and then the tear gas is like the moment of uprisings in Beirut, and then in New York. But then that also filters into the time of the virus. What comes next? I'm not sure. I'm just in Berlin trying to gain some footing, I would say.
Yeah.
Um, and let's see. I don't know. As we go deeper into the summer, and as summer comes to an end, let's see how we deal with the whatever nth wave we're on right now.
What's next for you?
In the last month, I've gotten my residency confirmed in Germany. So I will be based in Berlin for some time. This is, I think, also symptomatic of a larger wave of migration that is happening at the moment from Beirut and from the Arab world in general. So, like right now in Berlin, I have so many. I feel like there's a real artist Arab artist emigre community. A lot of Palestinians have moved here, a lot of Syrians have moved here, a lot of Egyptian people have moved here, and Lebanese, like these. And this is directly in the wake of the Arab Spring, what is termed the Arab Spring, and like the more recent uprisings in Beirut and Baghdad and elsewhere. And like now we're seeing Tunisia continue to flare up. So in a way, this is where I am now, and I feel like a lot of my current conversations are shaped by this kind of like almost. I mean, it is a kind of diaspora for sure. I think all my life I've had like again a very troubled relationship to the diaspora because I was always a native. Like I grew up in Beirut. I lived my life in Beirut. I started practicing in Beirut. And now for the first time, I'm really based somewhere else. Like I have residency outside of the country. Like of course I had done a lot of traveling back then, but it was always with Lebanon being my permanent residency location. And now it's different. So now I think that's what's going on for me, and I think it does feel good somehow to be able to locate yourself within a larger historical trend and community and social milieu. So I would say, yeah, that's where I am right now.
Thank you, Bassem, so much for your time today. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to check out any of the references from this conversation, please go to informerpodcast.com. Until next time, thanks for joining me at Informer, and I hope that you'll join us again.